Welcome everyone. Today's lecture recital is titled The Greek Idiom in Classical Music. In other words, I'll help you understand what makes a piece of music sound Greek to you. To make this a little bit more interesting, I will be playing some of the most representative solo piano works of Manolis Kalomiris, a composer who's now considered the father and the founder of the Greek National School. But before we go through all the details of today's presentation, discussing his musical language, the idiom, and the characteristics of the works, let us talk a little bit about Manolis Karamiris himself, his work, his ambition, and his accomplishments. Manolis Kalomiris was born in Smyrna in 1883, and he was drawn to music from an early age, studying piano in Athens, as well as in Constantinople and in Vienna, where he completed undergraduate piano studies in performance, in theory, composition, and musicology at the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, which translates as Music Society, Society of Music Friends in German. Realizing quite early in his career that he wanted to devote himself to music and to the formation of a Greek national school, he accepted a teaching job at the Obolensky Lyceum in Kharkov, which was then a Russian city, where he studied for 4 years from 1906 to 1910, familiarizing himself with the Russian idiom, absorbing their compositional techniques and the coloristic elements of their music. June 1908 saw the first concert of Kalomiris' works at the Athens Conservatory. In the program notes, the composer stated his ambition to create a Greek national school based on both authentic Greek folk idioms, as well as the most advanced compositional techniques as developed in Germany, France, Russia, and Norway. The 1908 concert, with his program notes now considered the manifest of the national school, divided audiences questioning the integral components of the national identity and what constituted nationalistic music composition. After a few more successful performances, Kalomiris returns to Greece permanently in 1910, and in 1911 he's offered a teaching position at the Athens Conservatory to teach piano, advanced history, and counterpoint. Through his beliefs, as well as his insistence on writing using the vernacular demotic Greek language, Kalomiris meets and forms close relationships with intellectuals and literary circles, and more specifically with the Greek poets Kostis Palamas and Angelos Ikelianos, as well as the Greek writer Nikos Kazantzakis. In 1919, after a clash with the head of the Athens Conservatory, Kalomiris decides to resign from his teaching duties and forms the Hellenic Conservatory, which he directs for the next 7 years. In 1926, he founds the National Conservatory of Music, which he directs until 1948, remaining the president of the Administrative Council until his death. Apart from being a prolific composer, he was a passionate pedagogue and a visionary artist who changed the state of classical music in early 20th century Greece through his teaching, performing, and writing. His theoretical and pedagogical treatises in the Greek language, which a list of which you can see in your slides, treatises in theory, tonal and chromatic harmony, music morphology, which basically means discussing forms of music, structure, shaping, organognosia, which in Greek means knowing the instruments, knowing the range of the instruments, the clefs that the music is written in, and so goes on. 4 series of ear training exercises, and many compositions for piano, voice, and choir are still in use to this day. Considering it equally important to educate the masses, Kalomiris was also for many years a music critic for the daily Athenian newspaper Ethnos, which translates as nation in Greek, influencing people's opinions about music as well as everyday matters. Throughout his life, he fought for his ideals regarding pure, authentic Greek music. By establishing associations, orchestras, and unions, he defended artists' entitlements, promoted Greek music abroad, hoping to create a Greek national music school that would protect and impart the Greek idiom to the next generation of musicians. Apart from being a composer, a music critic, the founder of the first Greek music conservatories, he was also the president of the Union of Greek Composers, the vice president of the Supreme Music Council of the Ministry of Education, the general director and chairman of the board of the National Opera in Athens, the general inspector of military music for the Greek armed forces. He was the first musician to be elected as a member of the Academy of Athens in 1945, huge honor for the time, and he received the National Award for Excellence in Letters and Fine Arts in 1919. Kalomiris' large output includes 3 symphonies, 5 operas, 1 concerto for piano, 1 concertino, which means shorter concerto for violin, hundreds of songs, literally, in the form of song cycles for voice and piano and voice and orchestra, and of course, compositions for solo piano, for chamber music, which means ensemble music for piano and other instruments, or just like string quartets, piano trios, piano and harp, and of course other symphonic works. In the next slide, you see Kalomiris' output for solo piano. All 13 advanced works that you see on your slide, as well as the 11 pieces for the younger pianist that he continues writing in 3 sets, are influenced from the legacy of the Romantic genre as it was cultivated by Chopin and Liszt. In today's lecture recital, I will only be presenting specific works of the 3 compositional periods of Kalomiris due to time restrictions, focusing on the evolution of the composer's style from the earlier romantic influenced works like the Patinada Opus 4, the third one on your slide, composed in 1907, to the more mature compositions of the middle period, like the first Rhapsody, Opus 21, that he composed in 1921, and of course concluding to the 5 preludes for piano, a short collection of pieces written in 1939, which marks the last advanced piano solo work of the composer, explaining what is the Greek idiom, what makes a piece of music sound Greek, and how the composer helped in the formation of the Greek National School of Music. But before we do all this, and before we dive into the details of the specific pieces, let us first explore what constitutes the Kalomirian idiom. In other words, what are the main characteristics of his music? As you will hear in my performance, Kalomiris' music is filled with dramatic pathos. It's exuberant, it's powerful. By combining modality with major and minor scales, as well as by mixing different modes together, he manages to create exotic and sensual colors that resemble the music of the gypsy, recalling Oriental and ancient Greek traditions. Making his music even more intense, he drastically alters the intervals of the tetrachords even during the same measure. His writing, because of that, resembles a lot the virtuosity of Liszt, combined thus with the lyricism of Chopin, and of course the dark melancholy of the Russian music school where he studied. He fills the texture with octaves and big lips, heavy chords that are spread throughout the keyboard, and almost always accelerates the rhythmic pulse with unpredictable arpeggiated motifs that move in different directions. The dominant use of the augmented second interval, the obsession with repetition and circulation of notes in a melodic line, as well as the intense use of chromaticism and melismatic contours, are just a few of the characteristics that we will hear, and of course, the characteristics that demonstrate the influence from the Greek folklore tradition. The use of the fourth interval and the harmonies filled with whole tone scales or scales built on just 6 notes or 5 notes are a few instances that display the French influences on his music, while the ostinato patterns and the pedal points definitely relate to the Byzantine chants. With these techniques, Kalomiris' music demonstrate a pastoral quality mixed with an improvisatory character set in a blurry background where the listener cannot predict what's going to happen next. His polyphonic writing includes passages of strict counterpoint with long and independent modal melodies in both hands, a characteristic that illustrates what we talked about before, the merging of the Western tradition with the Eastern folklore in his music. As we will hear, the composer makes use of double counterpoint techniques, creating dialogues between voices and hands, resulting, of course, in multiple layers of sound. His subjects often appear in pairs, presenting the first one as vigorous and assertive, and the second one as lyrical and melodical. In the first ones, that Kalomiris himself identified as masculine, we find passages of rhythmic vitality and a fiery, feisty character. In the second ones, which he himself called feminine, we find flexible and flowing melodies, often against an obsessive rhythmic idea in the other hand. Kalomiris' verbalism is evident in his agony to incorporate all of his ideas into the composition, sometimes cramming them together without elaboration. And of course, that creates complicated and almost incohesive, someone would say, works. He surrenders, he surrenders to his musical intuition, and of course that generates a chaotic form in which the performer, me, witnesses the composer's hopeless attempt to navigate from one idea to the next through dissonant, diminished, and dominant seventh chords used as transitional material. He creates a fusion, in other words, a musical chaos, in which the borders of one section to the next are not distinct. And of course, the whole composition this way may sound as if it derives from the same motive. He enjoys playing with the audience's expectations, and he very often moves in stepwise and chromatic motions, switching between keys, but officially he modulates to distant tonalities. This liquid quality of his music needs to be achieved through very unusual fingerings and very unfamiliar hand positions for me, for the performer, without ever losing the melismatic essence, which we would say is the core of Kalomiris' music. The concept of structure is defined more through contrasting themes, contrasting articulation, contrasting dynamics, agogic and expressive markings. In his thematic presentation of subjects and rhythmic pacing, Kalomiris was influenced from the German Romantic movement of Sturm und Drang. The composer, for the composer, contrast is conceived as a need for stress and release through suspension and acceleration of the rhythmic flow, the inflective dynamics, and the contrasting articulations. In his piano works, he often builds the intensity of the melodic material to an inevitable climax, leaving room for only one imaginable resolution through technically demanding glissandi in the form of octave glissandis, chord glissandis, and candenzant type passages. Here, we see an example of broken octave passages even in his first piece, Oriental Painting, which he composed as a student in 1902. Next, we find glissandi techniques with chords and octaves in his first ballade for piano, a piece that belongs to the first period of his compositional identity, as it was composed in 1905, but it was again reworked in 1933. Next, we find cadenzas with hand crossings in the Nichtiatiko, which translates as nocturne in Greek, an earlier piece of 1906 and reworked again in 1908. And last one, we find 6-note scale-wise passages in the first prelude for piano, composed in 1939, which you will hear at the end of today's presentation, divided between the hands, between the two hands by the composer. As you can see on the screen, a due mani means that you have to separate this phrasing in the two hands that you have. And of course, we cannot get into his pieces if we don't talk about rhythm, the most prominent characteristic of Kalomiris' musical language. Blending simple, composite, and mixed rhythms, Kalomiris creates complicated passages requiring the performer to interpret his works with appropriate declamation and emphasis, allowing the folk idiom to emerge. The concept of rhythm is a complicated idea for him, who conceives it more in combination with the melodic structure, with the articulation, with the dynamics, and overall with the form of the composition. Instead of forming a rhythmic skeleton upon which he can later establish his melodic inspiration, Kalomiris uses the concept of rhythm as an integral part of the narrative, building his inspiration of the ideas of tension and release. The composer's preference for asymmetrical rhythms creates irregular accents and unpredictable turns of the melodic material, resulting in an unstable flow and pacing. And because of that, the folk idiom prevails. In the solo pieces for piano specifically, Kalomiris employs the 7/8 meter, reminiscent of the Kalamatianos dance in Greece, and the 5/8 meter, quite frequently reminiscent of Chakonikos dance from the mixed asymmetrical rhythms of our tradition. Playing with accents and introducing upbeats, he frequently misplaces the strong beats of the measure, thus deceiving the listener, evoking a rather unfulfilling and restless tone. An example we see here again from the Oriental Painting, an earlier work of his from 1902, written in 4/4. So everybody expects that the accents are going to be on 1 and 3. But look what happens here. We have accent on 2, and later on we even have accent on the second eighth note on one end. The frequent rhythmic changes between consecutive measures is a mechanism that enables him to drastically change the musical concept and the character of the work. Here we have again an example of the first ballade for piano, a piece that he reworked later in his life. And I want you to notice not only the time signature changes from 5/8 to 6/8, back to 5/8, back to 5/16, back to 5/8, back to 33/8, and finally to the fermata. But also in the beginning, in the first line, as you can see it on your slide, you see that the music first is written in 3/8 notes, right? Then in the second measure, it moves to 6/8 notes. And then by using the same structure, he changes the 6/8 into 3/4. So even if he doesn't state it, he actually moves to a different time signature. And the performance must show that in the performance. As a genuinely romantic composer, Kalomiris employs and enjoys pairing different rhythmic figurations in harmonic concurrence, creating ambiguous harmonic and melodic structures and moments of agitation and suspension. Whenever he wishes, Kalomiris sets different tuplets against each other, like 2 notes against 3, 4 against 5, 6 against 7, causing textural and musical chaos for the performer and for the audience. Here, we see an example of the second prelude for piano, composed in 1939, which you will definitely hear today at the end of today's presentation, where we see very clearly quintuplets and sextuplets, meaning groups of 5 and 6 notes, against eighth notes and triplets in the ratio of 5 against 2, 6 against 2, 3 against 2, and so goes on. In other words, what we witness here is that the composer never hesitated to juxtapose any number of notes and rhythmic values in order to serve his purpose. Sometimes I would say that I feel that Calomiris fills in a measure any way he can just to get to the next measure. And I think in the end that this spontaneity is perhaps what describes best his impulse, his genius as part of the work. And I think in my 4 years working on his pieces so far, that this would be the most distinguishable and indisputable feature of his music. So, the first work I'll be presenting today is the Patinada, an early piece from 1907, which of course belongs to the first compositional period of Calomiris. It was first published in Germany by Breitkopf und Herdel editions. Remember that Calomiris studied in Germany, we said, in the Gesellschaft der Musikfreunde, the Music Society in Germany. So, of course, the first compositions are published by German editions. What's interesting about this piece is that it was published along with the Nocturne, the Nichtiatico, under the general title Pieces for Piano, Opus 4, something that reveals us that the composer actually intended to write a cycle of works that he never completed. The title Patinada is actually quite problematic. We're not certain about the derivative of the word, but it's most probably a synthesis of the ancient Greek words pato, which means walking in Greek, and ado, which means singing. And it's most probably referring to improvisatory songs that were sung and danced in the evening time with or without instrumental accompaniment as part of a wedding ceremony or a regional or national celebration. Their content could be romantic, could be witty, satirical, or even patriotic. Although the composition, as you will hear, follows a circular structure in which the introductory theme returns and concludes the piece, the whole composition resembles more of a mosaic of different ideas that are not quite blended together. As you can see on your slides, after a brief introduction, the first theme over here in the first page is presented following the romantic pattern of a monophonic melody accompanied with a harp-like arpeggiated left hand. The second theme, which you can see in the second page, enters almost as if interrupts the first idea. It's fierce, it's bold, and of course, it's derived from modal melodies. The two themes, I would say, kind of represent Calomiris' compositional identities. In the first theme, we have the Western European Calomiris, and the second theme represents his demotic, traditional vein. These two personalities, I would say, collaborate but also work against each other. And thus, Calomiris manages to continue his rising and intensifying energy all the way until the conclusion of the piece. The feature of his verbalism is seen through the technique of thematic variation. Despite the virtuosic nature of the left hand, as you can see on your slide, the left hand must be moving in extended broken chord arpeggiated positions, and of course that require from the performer very quick and unusual hand changes with very smooth passing of the thumb. And of course that accelerates the rhythmic pulse from triplets to sextuplets to 30 seconds. And despite all this mess, I would say, that happens in the left hand, what we see that prevails as the melody is it's a monophonic, prominently vocal character melody with a very prominent vocal character melody in the right hand, projecting and embellishing the melody with trills, with appoggiaturas and grace notes, another feature that shows us how important melody was for Calomiris. In the next slide, you see how he very manipulatively he inserts the chromatic motion in the bass, right? Measure 1 F, going to F sharp, going to G, going to A flat, going to A natural, B flat, C flat, which means B. as a technique to connect, but also build up the rising energy of the motive. The Greek character now radiates through modal inflections, through modal scales of the second theme, as we said before. He drastically changed the character using this 6-note scale figuration that you see on your page. And then, after he introduces it, he breaks it up gradually, leading to mixed modal scales with 2 augmented seconds, a very characteristic of his music overall. In addition, some of other techniques you're going to hear, we have unexpected accents in the weak beats of the measure. Again, we have gestural movements that relate more to glissando techniques, like sliding up and down the piano as if a traditional musician would do on a sanduri instrument in Greek table songs. The harp-like figurations, the arpeggiated chords, the embellishments that we talked about in the melodic line, the trills, the grace notes, I would say that all of these are reminiscent of the vocal improvisatory techniques that form the Greek traditional music. So, let us enjoy Patinada of 1907. Okay. I'm sure that many of you who have played Liszt or Chopin or Wagner at Pacific Piano School, you have heard the similarities of this first piece with the earlier romantically influenced works of Calomiris. And now get ready to be excited because we're moving into the middle compositional period with the Rhapsodies of 1921. In these pieces, we will hear that Calomiris finally is detached from the German school, from the German tradition, and he's now moving towards a freer language, which is, of course, closer to his artistic goals. The two rhapsodies that he composed in 1921 were published in France by Le Menestrel Editions in Paris in 1926, and because of their coloristic elements and their impressionistic idiom, were later, of course, orchestrated for a full orchestra. In today's lecture recital, unfortunately, I will be presenting only the first rhapsody because it's quite long, a piece that was dedicated to the Spanish pianist José Iturbide. He lived between 1895 and 1980, and he was actually the one who premiered the work. The Greek element in this rhapsody is shown with the articulation and the accentuation of the thematic material. The smooth fusion of the dance-like rhythmical sections that you will hear with the more narrative ethereal gestures, and of course the extreme keyboard ranges that carry the continuum of musical ideas. In addition, if you think that the fact that the piece is called Rhapsody, and of course the derivative of the word comes from the Greek rhapsodos, which means a reciter, a person who recites epic or usually Homeric poetry, that fact by itself creates another layer in these works, associating this first rhapsody of 1921 with the Greek idiom and the Greek culture. You will hear asymmetrical 5/4 rhythms, change of time signature, something we have witnessed before, from 5/4 to 4/4 to 2/4, use of dissonant seventh chords with extreme ranges of dynamics and unexpected accents, combinations of different tuplets between the hands. So here we see an example of 2 against 3 and 4 against 3, but we have many more, like 7 against 13, 8 against 9, and so goes on. Something that enhances even more the improvisatory element of Calomiris' music, and of course the improvisatory figurations of someone who's dancing Greek dances. But what's interesting about this piece, and the reason I selected this for today, is that the Rhapsody also combines the Greek idiom with a French element. We have harmonies built on intervals of fourths, fifths, and sixths. We have whole tone scales, we have stepwise motions and harp-like arpeggiated motifs and chords. We have lots of French style trills and ornaments in the melismatic contours of the right hand. Of course, syncopations, multiple tuplets as part of the horizontal structure, as we've seen before. Three-layer sound, a very characteristic of the style of Debussy and Ravel. Non-functional harmony, meaning that we have harmony that doesn't necessarily lead to cadences or doesn't necessarily serve a purpose in the work, just for the use of color, just for the use of chromaticism. And of course, contrasting colors of the most vivid, but also of the most pale colors, contrasting dynamics. The fact that Calomiris uh, exploits in his music descriptions like the ones you see here highlighted, un peu and the hor la mélodie, right, bring out the melody, arpeggier leggero, like play broken and lightly, expressive and dahor, like play out with expressiveness, definitely relate Calomiris' coloristic palette to the musical language of Claude Debussy and Maurice Ravel, the two most representative impressionistic composers. But I would say, most importantly, this first rhapsody honors the guiding and central element of impressionistic music, the sine qua non of the sonorous sound. So, to put it in different words for anyone who's not so into this idea, if you think about a painting of an impressionist artist, you'll see that he doesn't really depict the object itself. He depicts the movement of the light and the color in the specific moment that he captures the object. So the same thing happens in Calomiris' music. We have the veil of sonority. We have imaginative orchestral writing, and of course, imaginative use of pedaling. Masterfully, he creates a canvas where he fuses the French with the Greek idiom, even through the scales. He uses modulations of Western European scales, of modal scales, but also scales of his own invention, as you can see here. 5-note scales as melodic material, but also fragments of modal scales as ostinato patterns, something that links us back to the Byzantine tradition, as we've said before. In the mature writing of this first rhapsody, we find some characteristics of Calomiris that we've talked about in the introduction. We will see his technique of thematic variation, where he takes a theme and he reworks on it more and more elaborately until the end. We will hear cadenza type passages of extreme virtuosity, and you will witness yourselves a very fast, almost breathless grand finale at the end with big octaves and chords. His symphonic writing emerges through thick chords, blocked and broken octaves, intervals of tenths, which are very hard to catch in this tempo, and figurations in extreme keyboard ranges. Like you'll see me jumping from one corner of the piano to the next. The concept of contrast, which we've said before, a very important characteristic of his music, is expressed here through changes in articulation, but also texturally through acceleration and suspension of the rhythmic pulse. We will see his favorite techniques, the technique of stringendo, but also the technique of strepitoso and precipitato, which means precipitate, right? Accelerate in his music. Let us enjoy the first Rhapsody of 1921. Very different than before. I assume you have already witnessed it. Okay. And after the first rhapsody, we come to the last collection for today's lecture recital, the Five Preludes for Piano, written in 1939, a collection of five pieces that present the composer's writing in its most mature stage. I would say that this last piano set epitomizes Calomiris' idiomatic writing. We will hear many characteristics that we have witnessed before in previous pieces. The mixing of Western scales with modal structures, the new invention scales by Calomiris himself, the intense use of chromaticism, the obsession with repetition and circulation of notes in the melodic line. We will hear characteristics of the middle period, the French element shown with harmonies built on intervals of fourths and fifths. We will hear the characteristic augmented second in the scale. Of course, long melismatic lines, the Byzantine ostinato patterns, the pedal points of the ancient Greek tradition, asymmetrical and mixed meters, frequent changes of meter, of time signatures, and of course, combinations of different tuplets against each other, all fused in order to enhance the improvisatory element of Calomiris' music. The first prelude with the description molto agitato and appassionato, was dedicated to Calomiris' daughter, Crino, an accomplished pianist, a touring pianist at the time, and many times premiering also her father's works. The prelude is written in an ABA form, and as you will hear, it combines the Greek character with the Roshan influences of Calomiris' earlier works, like in the patina that we have seen in the beginning. In the first theme, as you can see in your slide, the left-hand texture is built on an ostinato pattern, a repetitive pattern that harmonically supports the right-hand melody as a sound effect technique, something that you have already heard in the previous Rhapsody. Gradually, from this ostinato sound effect pattern, he builds two independent lines, as you can see, moving chromatically, first in combination to each other, right, parallel to each other, and then in the second measure, moving against each other in extreme registers of the keyboard, creating a fusion of sound, as if Calomiris wants to create a musical Tower of Babel, right, musically not understanding what's happening. The middle section comes as an answer to the fiery masculine introductory theme. Remember what we said in the beginning, that many times Calomiris puts his two thematic ideas in contrary to each other. So the first one is masculine, and now the second here comes more flowing, more calm, with a feminine liquidity and feminine fragility. As seen in previous works, Calomiris employs different virtuosic techniques to release the tension in his music, especially after the intense chromaticism that he uses. So here at the end, he blends the hands in contrary chromatic scales. He uses octave passages moving in triplets and 16th notes against each other in an agitato tempo, in an agitated tempo, as if he wants to make the music explode with accents and big sforzandos at the end. The second prelude that comes next, with the description Adantino Piacevole, was dedicated to a friend, Alekos Georgiades. And you will hear that, same as in the Rhapsody of 1921, this prelude derives much inspiration from the French tradition. You already see from the slide, like the first theme is much more peaceful, right? More free. It opens, we would say, with a messianesque sound. The chords, as you can see in the third measure, already in the melody, are built on intervals of fourths and fifths. The phrasing is kind of tilting, and the way of writing is more improvisatory. We need, in contrary to the first prelude, here we need a weightless technique, as if the music evaporates. The strong improvisatory writing, again, as you can see, comes after the second page, where the second prelude quickly dissolves with increasingly animated melismas, as if Kalomiris wants to make his music dance, or as if he wants to imitate a Greek dance, although we don't have very clear references. The third prelude, with the description appassionato con modo, passion with motion, was composed in Notre Dame de Mont in Antony, France, and was also dedicated to his daughter Crinon. The piece, as you can already see from the description and also from the beginning, shares the same character as the first prelude. The description also comes as consciously interrupting the meditative state of the second prelude. You can see in your slides the chords are bold, they're very daring in extreme registers of the keyboard again. He creates an orchestral sound, we would say. He goes beyond the sound of the piano. Very audacious chords, fearless octaves up and down the keyboard. The hands are not even collaborating, like you need to have very good coordination in these passages to describe all these abrupt changes of articulation and ornaments with the unpredictable accents, as if Kalomiris wants to describe a more percussive sound of the piano. Again, the left-hand ostinato patterns, as you can see, allow the improvisatory melodic material to emerge through very precarious, as you will hear, rhythmic patterns of fast and contrasting gestures, something that is reminiscent of our Greek dances in the Greek islands, the Balos dance and the Pedozali dances. The fourth prelude, I would say my favorite in the whole collection today, is a very unique example among everything we have heard so far. And that's why I'm including a manuscript of the prelude by the composer's handwriting. It was dedicated to Lila Lalauni, a very prominent pianist of the time and a composer, a female composer that lived in the same period with Kalomiris. The fourth prelude continues in the fluid and abstract character of the second prelude, but the Greek idiom radiates this time through the 7/8 Kalamatianos rhythm, which reminds us of the Kalamatianos dance, which is, I would say, the most prominent, the most famous dance in Greece, the Byzantine techniques of ostinato, and of course, the melismatic essence of the melody. This piece sounds as if someone is lamenting, as if someone is mourning with sorrow, and he shivers with desolation all the way to the last note. And of course, after that, again interrupting the meditative state of the fourth prelude, comes the fifth, Assai vivo e vigoroso, with valiance, also dedicated to the same pianist, Lila Lalauni. This fifth prelude recycles many textural and musical characteristics that we have witnessed before. It's vigorous and valiant in character, has dashing chords, elevated octaves. It shines brilliantly with dotted dance-like figurations, as you can see already from the first theme. And I would say it resembles kind of the character of the third prelude. However, as you can see, the daring moving from one side of the keyboard to the next resembles a little bit with the dazzling grand finale that we have seen in the first prelude. So I would say, in a way, Kalomiris tries to cycle the piece together. He tries to round what he did in the first prelude, right? Bring it up in the fifth prelude as if he wants to circulate the work. The second theme that you can see on your page comes again more calm, more fluid, emitting a more folk tone, a more traditional Greek tone in the work, but it comes after the glissando, right? So the energy was again built up, it was expressed with the glissando as if nothing else could depict it, and then that goes back to the calm sound of the second theme. Masterfully, he brings out the modal melody sounding in triplets here, above a quintuplet ostinato in distant registers. It might confuse you because you see the triplet is written in the middle line here with the left hand, while the right hand on top is having the accompaniment in quintuplets. I would describe that as wrestling. It seems that to me that the triplet is wrestling with the quintuplet. The two elements escalate the dynamics, escalate the tension, And of course, as you can imagine, that would definitely explode in huge glissandes up and down the piano, closing the set, closing the last piece that Camilla Miris ever composed for solo piano with the most dexterous and powerful finale. So, after all this, let us enjoy the five preludes together as a cycle, the last piece written in 1939. I'm sure that by now you understand what I mean, that he embedded his pluralistic personality in his music. His vision and his dynamic presence in everything related to music helped Kalomiris provoke the Greek music scene in the first half of the 20th century, leaving an indelible imprint on the modern Greek culture, as you can hear. The fact that his life and his works have been and continue to be up to this day a subject of interest and rigorous research validates the influential and essential role of Kalomiris in the formation of the Greek national identity. Today, 60 years after his death, he continues to be an inspiration for me and for every artist. Despite the difficulty he came across, he remained committed to his ideals. He gave to the next generation of musicians something more than his work. He gave an example of a creator who does not adjust, who does not alter his beliefs. And more than that, in the turbulent times that we live, I think Kalomiris taught us that we can always find strength and inspiration from returning to our roots. I hope that today's lecture recital opened our eyes and our ears a little bit more, and that it has engaged you with music that you have probably never heard before. Let this guide you, finding your strength and inspiration that I'm sure it's needed when you embrace your music and make you love your art to the very core. Thank you for being with me today, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Have a great rest of your Sunday.